Trey Collins didn't have much left in this world, but he'd kept two things, his pride and his sense of right and wrong. And today, both were being tested. His heart thundered in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he stepped in front of the terrified little girl, Sophia Turner. She couldn't have been more than 8, her golden hair tangled and eyes wide with terror. Dirt streaked her pale cheeks, and she clutched her backpack like it was the only thing keeping her safe from the pack of teenage bullies that surrounded them. The boys were older, bigger, and meaner, with harsh sneers twisting their faces. The ringleader, a lanky kid with a cruel laugh, had a rock in his hand. His knuckles whitened as he tightened his grip.
"You think some homeless bum is gonna scare us off?"
The boy spat, his voice full of venom. He took a step forward, his shadow falling over Trey and Sophia. The other bullies jeered, egging him on. Trey didn't flinch. His worn, weathered coat did little to hide the tension in his muscles, the way he stood like a shield between Sophia and the boys. He'd faced worse than a bunch of punk teenagers, but that didn't make the fear any less real. His voice came out steady, low, and firm.
"Leave her alone."
The laughter faltered, just for a second, and Trey saw a flicker of hesitation in the ringleader's eyes. But then the boy scoffed, tossing the rock up and down in his hand.
"And what are you gonna do if we don't, old man?"
The question hung in the air, heavy with threat. Trey knew the answer he wanted to give, the one that burned in his gut. But violence wouldn't solve this. It never had. His mind raced, looking for another way, any way to get Sophia out of this unharmed. Sophia whimpered behind him, the sound slicing through Trey's heart like a knife. He shifted slightly, positioning himself to shield her completely. The boys closed in, and Trey could see the flash of anger in their eyes, a kind of rage he knew all too well, a rage born from pain, from being ignored, from wanting to feel powerful at any cost. The ringleader drew his arm back, preparing to throw the rock, and then the sound of screeching tires shattered the tension. A black SUV roared up the path, coming to a sudden jarring stop. The doors burst open, and out stepped Marcus Turner, a man whose presence commanded attention even in chaos. His suit was crisp, his expression one of pure, unbridled fury as he locked eyes with Trey. Marcus's gaze flicked to his daughter, his voice breaking through the silence with an authority that left no room for argument.
"Sophia, get over here now."
Trey felt the air shift, the balance of power tilting as Marcus stormed toward them, his eyes blazing with a father's protective wrath. But there was something else there too, a suspicion, a judgment directed squarely at Trey, a judgment Trey had seen 1,000 times before. Trey Collins didn't belong anywhere, or at least that's how he felt most days. The park was the closest thing he had to a home. It wasn't much, just a patch of grass and a few trees surrounded by cracked sidewalks and rusting playground equipment. But under the towering sycamore, with its sprawling branches offering shade and a small sense of protection, Trey found a kind of solace he couldn't find anywhere else in Willow Creek City. He sat there that morning, back pressed against the rough bark, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out coat. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant car exhaust. People bustled past, too busy with their own lives to notice the man who had become a part of the park's scenery. Trey had learned to blend in, to become invisible. But today, a sense of restlessness gnawed at him. Maybe it was the way the wind whispered through the leaves, or the sound of children laughing in the distance, a sound that always pulled at a place deep inside him, a place he tried to keep buried. Memories of laughter, of a small, warm hand gripping his, of a child's giggles that once filled his life, came unbidden. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memories away. "Don't go there," he whispered to himself, a mantra he repeated every time the past tried to break through. But the weight of loss was heavy, even after all these years. He had learned to live with it, like a ghost that followed him, a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he'd failed to protect. His stomach growled, a cruel reminder of the meager meal he'd had the night before. He could ignore hunger. He was used to that. It was the other emptiness that hurt, the kind that food couldn't fill, the kind that made his chest ache when he saw fathers pushing their kids on the swings or mothers chasing their toddlers through the park. Trey's eyes flickered open when he heard a high-pitched, frightened scream. His head snapped toward the playground, where a group of rough-looking teenage boys had cornered a little girl. She was small, with golden hair and big, terrified eyes. Her backpack, decorated with pink and purple unicorns, hung awkwardly from her shoulders as she tried to back away. "No," she whimpered, clutching the straps of her backpack, her voice trembling. The bullies sneered, circling her like wolves. Trey's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to avoid trouble. He was homeless, powerless, barely surviving day to day. Getting involved would only bring trouble. But then he saw the ringleader grab the little girl's shoulder and shove her. She stumbled and fell, her knees scraping against the dirt, and that was enough. Trey was on his feet before he could think. His legs, stiff from sitting for so long, propelled him forward, and he moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he didn't hesitate. "Hey!" he called, his voice cracking through the cold morning air. The boys turned, surprised at first, but their surprise quickly twisted into contempt when they saw who had interrupted them. Trey's clothes were shabby, his hair unkempt, and his face bore the hard lines of a life lived rough. The ringleader, a boy with a buzz cut and a smirk too cocky for his years, sized Trey up and rolled his eyes. "Mind your own business, old man," the boy spat, tossing his head in a dismissive gesture. Trey ignored the sting of the insult. He'd been called worse. He focused on the girl who was still on the ground, her wide eyes shimmering with tears. She looked so small, so fragile, and something inside him cracked open, a long-forgotten instinct to protect. "Let her go," Trey said, his voice low and steady. He stepped between the girl and the bullies, his frame not nearly as imposing as he wished it were. The boys were taller, healthier, full of the energy of youth, while Trey's body bore the signs of years spent sleeping on hard benches and fighting to survive. The ringleader sneered, emboldened by his friend's laughter. "And what are you going to do about it?" He stepped closer, his breath smelling of cheap candy and arrogance. Trey's hands clenched into fists inside his coat pockets, but he knew he couldn't afford to fight. One wrong move and he could end up in jail, or worse, but he couldn't let them hurt her. "Walk away," Trey said, his voice firm but calm. He stared the boy down, hoping his resolve would be enough. For a moment there was silence, the kind that made the world feel like it had stopped spinning. Trey held his breath, feeling the tension coil tighter and tighter. Then finally the ringleader seemed to waver. He glanced at his friends and Trey could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. "Come on," the boy muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. "This isn't worth it." The other boys grumbled, but they followed him, throwing dirty looks over their shoulders as they slunk away. Trey stayed still, his whole body taut with the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. Only when the boys were out of sight did he dare to exhale. He turned to the little girl, who was still sitting on the ground, her eyes wide and filled with awe and relief. "You okay?" Trey asked, his voice softening as he crouched down to her level. The girl nodded, but her bottom lip quivered. Trey's heart clenched. She looked so lost, so much like another little girl he used to know, a girl who was gone now. He swallowed hard, pushing the memories back. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sophia," she whispered, clutching her backpack tighter. Trey felt his muscles slowly unclench as Sophia's shaky voice reached his ears. Her eyes, round and blue like a summer sky, shimmered with tears. She tried so hard to hold back. Trey saw the scrapes on her knees, the dirt smudged on her cheeks, and a protective surge swept over him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled but clean napkin, one he'd held onto for emergencies. With a gentleness that seemed out of place in his rough hands, he offered it to her. Sophia hesitated, her small fingers trembling, but she took it, dabbing at the dirt and blood on her knees. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so small and fragile that it made Trey's heart ache. She looked up at him, and in that moment, he saw the trust in her eyes, a trust that he knew he had to honor, even if the world rarely gave him the same courtesy. "Where's your dad?" Trey asked softly, his voice carrying none of the roughness his appearance might have suggested. He knew how this would look. A homeless man crouched next to a crying little girl in a park. He could almost feel the eyes of passers-by, the judgment they carried, but he pushed those thoughts aside. Right now, this child was his only concern. Sophia wiped her face and sniffled, clutching her backpack like it was her last line of defense. He's coming," she stammered, her voice breaking. "But he's always late. He's really busy." The words hit Trey harder than he expected. He knew the sting of waiting for someone who never seemed to have time. He had been that child once, and the memory made something twist painfully inside him. He offered Sophia a small smile, one he hoped would reassure her. "Well," he said, settling into a sitting position beside her, "how about I wait with you until he gets here? I promise, the bullies won't come back." He tried to keep his voice light, even though the adrenaline was still ebbing away, leaving his hands trembling slightly. Sophia looked at him, studying his face like she was trying to figure out if she could believe him. After a moment, she nodded, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Trey let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The two of them sat in silence for a while. Trey kept his eyes on the playground, scanning for any signs of trouble. The wind rustled through the sycamore leaves above them, and the city's noise seemed a little softer here, as if the park were a fragile bubble protecting them from the chaos beyond. "Do you live here?" Sophia's small voice cut through the quiet, and Trey turned to find her staring at him with that same curious, innocent gaze. Her question caught him off guard, but he saw no judgment in her eyes, just genuine curiosity. "In a way," Trey said, his voice careful, "I'm here a lot." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. He didn't want to burden her with the details of his life. His sleepless nights under bus stop shelters, the ache of hunger that never quite went away, or the way the world seemed to forget people like him. Sophia tilted her head, her brows furrowed. "That must be lonely," she said, and Trey felt his chest tighten. He didn't know how to respond to that, not when the truth was so heavy. Loneliness had become his constant companion, one he'd learned to live with but never quite accepted. "Sometimes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, "but you get used to it." Sophia's frown deepened, and she hugged her backpack tighter. "I get lonely too," she confessed, her voice cracking. "My dad works a lot. He's a lawyer, and he's always on his phone or at his office. Even when he's home, he's busy." Trey's heart squeezed at her words. It was a different kind of loneliness, but he understood it all the same. He had been so focused on surviving that he hadn't thought about how this little girl, with all her wealth and privilege, could feel the same emptiness he did. Loneliness, he realized, didn't care about money or status. It crept into the lives of the rich and poor alike. Before he could respond, the distant roar of an engine grew louder. Trey's head snapped up, and he saw the sleek black SUV from earlier speeding down the park's path. The vehicle pulled up to the curb, tires screeching, and the door flew open. Marcus Turner stepped out, his eyes blazing with a mix of panic and fury. "Sophia!" Marcus's voice cut through the air, and Sophia's head whipped around. Relief flooded her face, and she scrambled to her feet. Trey stood up too, feeling the familiar weight of judgment settle over him as Marcus's eyes locked onto his. Marcus was a man who commanded attention, tall with broad shoulders and a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power. His jaw was clenched, and his dark eyes flicked between Trey and Sophia, suspicion clouding his features. Sophia ran to her father, throwing her arms around his waist. "Daddy!" she cried, her voice cracking. Marcus knelt, wrapping his arms around her and holding her tightly, his hands smoothing her tangled hair. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer but still tense. "What happened?" Sophia pulled back just enough to look up at him. "Some boys were mean to me, but Trey helped," she said, her small hand pointing back at Trey. Marcus's eyes snapped to Trey, and the look he gave him was enough to make Trey's stomach twist. It was a look he knew all too well, skepticism, fear, and thinly veiled contempt. Trey raised his hands, palms out in a gesture of peace. "I was just trying to help," he said, his voice calm but wary. "She was in trouble." Marcus's jaw tightened, and he straightened, pulling Sophia closer. "I appreciate that," he said, but his tone was clipped, formal, like he was speaking to someone he couldn't quite trust. His eyes flicked over Trey's ragged coat, his scuffed boots, and the weariness etched into his face. Trey could almost hear the thoughts running through Marcus's mind, assumptions, judgments, all based on what he saw. Sophia looked up at her father, her brow furrowed. "Trey's nice, Daddy," she said, her voice small but insistent. "He waited with me." Marcus's expression softened, but only slightly. He kept his eyes on Trey, his posture still defensive. "Well," he said, his voice still tight, Thank you for staying with her, but we'll be going now. Trey nodded, swallowing the bitterness that threatened to rise. He knew better than to expect gratitude, knew that men like Marcus Turner saw him as a danger, a threat, just for existing. It didn't matter that he had protected Sophia, that he had acted with nothing but kindness. His appearance, his status, condemned him in Marcus's eyes. Take care, kid, Trey said, giving Sophia a small smile. She looked back at him, her eyes wide and sad, like she understood more than a child her age should have to. Bye, Trey, she whispered, clinging to her father's hand as he led her away. Trey watched them go, the black SUV swallowing them up and speeding off, leaving him alone once more. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Trey let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned back to his spot under the sycamore, the place that had been his sanctuary. But the quiet peace he had found there earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that wouldn't leave. He sat down, pulling his coat tighter around himself as the wind picked up. The world kept moving, just as it always did. But today, something felt different. Today, he had made a difference, however small. And for now, that was enough. Marcus Turner gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The black SUV cut through traffic, tires squealing as he took a sharp turn toward Willow Creek Park. His heart was pounding in his chest, a wild drumbeat of panic and anger. Sophia's call had come in 10 minutes ago, and those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. She had sounded scared, her voice tiny and trembling, and the thought of something happening to her filled Marcus with a fear he could barely contain. The SUV roared down the final stretch of road, and Marcus caught sight of the playground through the windshield. Relief surged through him when he saw Sophia standing there, unharmed. But that relief was tempered with fury when he spotted the ragged man next to her. Marcus slammed on the brakes, the vehicle screeching to a stop, and threw open the door. "Sophia!" he called, his voice cracking with a mix of relief and anger. He practically ran toward her, his heart pounding as he pulled her into his arms. The weight of her small body against his chest grounded him, but the fear still pulsed through his veins. Sophia clung to him, her little hands fisting in the fabric of his suit. "Daddy!" she sobbed, and Marcus's chest tightened at the sound of her tears. He smoothed a hand over her tangled hair, trying to calm his own racing heart. "It's okay, baby," he whispered, holding her close. "I'm here now. You're safe." But as he looked over her shoulder, his gaze landed on the man standing a few feet away. Marcus's eyes narrowed, taking in the man's tattered coat, the dirt on his jeans, the weariness carved into his face. Everything about the man screamed danger. Instinct and his role as a father took over, and Marcus's protective rage bubbled to the surface. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp as he set Sophia back on her feet and kept a hand on her shoulder. His glare was directed at the stranger, who held his hands up in a placating gesture. "I didn't mean any harm," the man said calmly, though Marcus could see the way his jaw tightened. "I was just making sure she was safe." Marcus's skepticism only deepened. His eyes swept over the scene, taking in the dirt on Sophia's knees, the way her hands trembled as she wiped at her tears. He had worked hard to shield his daughter from anything that could hurt her, and seeing her like this sent a wave of guilt and anger crashing through him. Sophia tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, Trey, help me," she insisted, her voice small but insistent. "Those boys were being mean, and Trey made them leave." Marcus's gaze flicked back to the man. Trey, she had called him. His protective instincts warred with the gratitude he knew he should feel. He couldn't deny that this man had stepped in when he wasn't there, but the thought of a stranger, especially one who looked so rough, being near his daughter, made Marcus's skin crawl. "Thank you," Marcus said stiffly, his voice polite but strained. He didn't let go of Sophia, didn't relax his grip even for a second. His eyes remained wary, full of the doubts that came with being a father in a world where danger could lurk anywhere. Trey's face betrayed nothing but calm, though Marcus thought he saw a flicker of something, hurt, anger, in his eyes. Trey simply nodded, as if he was used to this, as if he knew what Marcus was thinking. That thought made Marcus's stomach twist, but he shoved the feeling aside. "No problem," Trey replied, his voice steady. He looked at Sophia, and something softened in his gaze. "I'm glad she's okay." Sophia, for her part, seemed confused by the tension between her father and Trey. She looked up at Marcus, her blue eyes wide and pleading. "Daddy, Trey is nice," she said, her voice wavering. "He was really brave." Marcus felt his heart clench, but he didn't let the emotion show on his face. He knew he was being harsh, but being cautious had kept Sophia safe more times than he cared to remember. He tightened his jaw, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. "We'll be going now," Marcus said, his voice still cool and controlled. He picked Sophia up, holding her protectively against his chest. As he turned to leave, he glanced back at Trey, who stood there, watching them with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. The walk back to the SUV was tense. Marcus kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting Trey to follow them. When he reached the car, he set Sophia down and opened the back door, gently helping her into her seat. She buckled herself in, her eyes still glistening with unshed tears. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, exhaling a shaky breath. He glanced in the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of Trey, still standing under the sycamore tree. There was something about the way the man held himself, something about the quiet dignity in his posture that made Marcus pause. But he pushed the thought away, turning the key in the ignition and driving off, leaving the park and Trey behind. The drive home was silent. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Sophia sat quietly in the back seat, her usual chatter replaced by a thoughtful silence. Marcus had never seen her this subdued, and it made his heart ache in ways he couldn't fully express. He had always prided himself on protecting her, but today he had failed. He hadn't been there when she needed him most. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he replayed the encounter in the park. The image of that man, Trey, standing between Sophia and those bullies, kept flashing through his mind. Marcus knew he should be grateful. The man had done what he couldn't, had defended his daughter when he wasn't there. But all Marcus could feel was a mix of relief, guilt, and suspicion. "Daddy?" Sophia's small voice broke through his thoughts. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. "Yeah, baby." "Why were you mad at Trey?" she asked, her blue eyes wide and searching. "He was nice to me." The question hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He hadn't realized how obvious his discomfort had been, and hearing it from his daughter made him feel even worse. He took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I wasn't mad at him," Marcus said slowly, though he wasn't sure if that was entirely true. "I was just worried. I didn't know who he was, and I wanted to make sure you were safe." Sophia's brows knitted together, her young mind working to understand. "But he helped me," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. "He was brave." Marcus's chest tightened at her words. Brave. It wasn't a word he had expected to hear in connection to Trey, a homeless man who looked like he had been through hell and back. But Sophia had seen something in Trey that Marcus hadn't, or maybe something he had refused to see. "I know he did," Marcus said, his voice gentler now, "and I'm glad he was there for you." The admission tasted bitter, tangled with his own guilt and pride. He couldn't deny that Trey had done something good, but the protective father in him still struggled to trust. The rest of the drive home passed in a blur. When they finally pulled into the driveway of their upscale modern house, Marcus felt the weight of the day settle heavily on his shoulders. He parked the SUV and turned off the engine, but for a moment he just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. Sophia unbuckled her seatbelt and looked at him expectantly. Marcus forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Come on, let's get you inside," he said. They walked into the house where the familiar warmth of home greeted them. The scent of vanilla candles lingered in the air, and the soft hum of the refrigerator buzzed in the background. But today, the house felt emptier, more oppressive, as if Marcus's guilt had seeped into the walls. Sophia kicked off her shoes and ran upstairs to her room, leaving Marcus alone in the quiet. He sank onto the leather couch, his elbows on his knees, and his head in his hands. The weight of the day pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. Marcus picked it up and saw a text from his colleague and close friend, David Chen. "David, hey, how's it going? Need to talk about the upcoming case?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. He was supposed to be preparing for a high-stakes trial, one that could make or break his career. But right now, all he could think about was his daughter and the man who had saved her. He typed out a quick reply. Marcus. Not great. Had a scare with Sophia today. We can talk tomorrow. Almost immediately, David replied. David, everything okay? Want to talk about it? Marcus hesitated, then started typing. Marcus. Some guys were bullying Sophia in the park. A homeless man stepped in and helped her. I don't know what to think. David's response was thoughtful, as always. David. Wow, glad she's okay. As for the guy, be careful, but maybe don't judge too quickly. Sometimes people surprise you. Marcus put the phone down and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. David was right, of course. Judging too quickly was a habit he had developed over years of working in the legal system, where assessing threats and protecting his own interests were second nature. But this was different. This wasn't about a case. This was about his daughter. He rubbed his temples, trying to clear his mind. The image of Trey's face, lined with exhaustion but steady, brave, refused to leave him. Marcus hated how conflicted he felt. Part of him wanted to forget the whole thing, to move on and focus on his work. But another part of him, a quieter, more insistent part, couldn't shake the feeling that he owed Trey more than just suspicion. Meanwhile, across the city, Trey sat hunched on a bench under a dim street lamp. The cold night air bit through his thin coat, but he barely felt it. His mind was replaying the events of the day, the fear in Sophia's eyes, the relief when Marcus had shown up, and the way Marcus had looked at him, like he was something to be feared, something unworthy. Trey closed his eyes, the sting of shame mixing with a stubborn anger. He was used to being judged, used to people looking at him and seeing only his ragged clothes and tired face. But today had felt different. Today he had done something good, something that mattered, and it still hadn't been enough. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor and harder living. Once, these hands had built beautiful things. He had been a skilled carpenter, proud of his work, proud of the life he had built with his own two hands. But life had a cruel way of taking things away, piece by piece, until all that was left was the ghost of who he used to be. A flyer fluttered in the wind, catching Trey's attention. It had been pinned to the bench beside him, advertising a job opening at Henderson Construction. Trey reached out and took the flyer, the paper crinkling in his grip. It was probably a long shot, but what did he have to lose? Maybe it was time to start trying again, even if trying felt like an uphill battle he was destined to lose. He folded the flyer and tucked it into his pocket, standing up and pulling his coat tighter around himself. The city lights glimmered in the distance, a reminder that the world kept moving, with or without him. Trey took a breath and started walking, each step feeling heavier than the last. Back at the Turner house, Marcus sat in his darkened office, the glow of his computer screen casting shadows across the room. He was supposed to be reviewing case files, but the words blurred together. All he could think about was Sophia, and the way she had looked at Trey, with trust, with gratitude. His phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert about the growing homelessness crisis in Willow Creek City. The headline made him pause, his conscience pricking at him. He had always considered himself compassionate, a man who fought for justice in the courtroom. But today, he had seen how easy it was to judge, to let fear cloud his perception. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. He didn't know what the right answer was, but he knew he couldn't ignore the truth forever. Trey had saved his daughter, and that meant something, even if Marcus wasn't ready to admit it yet. As the night deepened, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He would keep an eye on Trey, not just out of caution, but out of curiosity. Because for the first time in a long while, Marcus realized he had more to learn about people, about trust, and about himself. Trey's nights were always long, but tonight felt heavier than usual. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford, and even when he managed to close his eyes, his dreams were plagued with memories of a life he had lost and the ghosts that haunted him. The park bench he often called home was cold and unforgiving, but it was his, at least for now. The wind rustled through the trees, and Trey pulled his thin coat tighter around himself. The flyer for Henderson Construction crumpled in his hand. The idea of a job, of stability, felt like a distant dream, but Sophia's tearful face and the look of trust she had given him lingered in his mind. Maybe it was time to try again. To morning brought the harsh light of reality. Trey washed up as best he could at a public restroom, using cold water to wipe away the exhaustion etched into his face. His reflection in the cracked mirror was a reminder of how far he had fallen, but he refused to let himself dwell on it. He ran a hand through his hair, smoothed the wrinkles in his shirt, and tucked the flyer into his pocket. He made his way to Henderson Construction, his stomach a tight knot of nerves. The building was large and bustling, with workers moving in and out, their voices loud and full of energy. Trey hesitated at the entrance, feeling the familiar weight of self-doubt pressing down on him. He almost turned around, almost gave in to the fear that whispered he wasn't good enough. But then he thought of Sophia, of how he had promised to keep her safe, even if she didn't realize it. He straightened his back and stepped through the doors. The receptionist, a young woman with a warm smile and curly hair pulled back in a ponytail, looked up as he approached. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked, her voice friendly. Trey swallowed, his throat dry. "I'm here about the job," he said, holding up the flyer. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. She nodded and handed him a clipboard with a job application. "Fill this out, and I'll let Mr. Henderson know you're here." Trey took the clipboard, his hands trembling slightly as he sat down in the waiting area. The questions on the application felt like obstacles. Employment history, references, a section asking about any criminal record. Trey's pen hovered over the paper, and his heart sank. How could he explain the years he had spent lost, the mistakes he had made that still haunted him? He filled out what he could, leaving sections blank that he couldn't answer honestly. When he handed the clipboard back, he felt like he had already failed. The receptionist smiled at him again, though he could see the sympathy in her eyes. "Mr. Henderson will be with you shortly," she said. Trey sat back down, his foot tapping nervously against the floor. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a world he didn't belong to anymore. But he forced himself to stay, to breathe, to hope. Jim Henderson was a man who didn't waste time. He was in his early 50s, with a strong build and a no-nonsense attitude that had built his company from the ground up. When he stepped into the waiting area and saw Trey, he paused, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. "Trey Collins?" he asked, his voice deep and authoritative. Trey stood up, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm of nerves in his gut. Jim gestured for Trey to follow him into his office. The room was decorated with photos of past construction projects and a large polished desk that seemed almost out of place with the dust and grit of the worksite outside. Jim sat down behind the desk, and Trey took the chair across from him. Jim studied Trey for a moment, his gaze piercing. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "tell me why you're here." Trey cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I used to be a carpenter," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "Before things fell apart, I'm looking for a chance to work again, to get back on my feet." Jim raised an eyebrow. "Carpenter, huh? Any references?" Trey hesitated, the question hitting him like a punch. He had no one left to vouch for him, no one who would speak to his skills or his character. He shook his head, his gaze dropping. "No, sir," he admitted, "but I'm willing to prove myself." Jim's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered with something. Curiosity, perhaps. He leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "We don't have time for second chances around here," he said, his voice blunt. "This is a fast-paced job, and I need people I can count on. Why should I take a risk on you?" Trey's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to defend himself, to explain everything, but he knew that desperation wouldn't get him anywhere. Instead, he took a deep breath and met Jim's gaze. "Because I've got nothing left to lose," Trey said, his voice steady and full of raw honesty. "And because I know how to work hard. Give me a chance and I won't let you down." Jim watched him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he sighed and rubbed his chin. "All right," he said, surprising Trey. "Let's see what you've got. You mess up and you're out. Got it?" Relief and disbelief flooded through Trey, and he nodded. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Jim stood up, extending a calloused hand. "Be here tomorrow at 7 sharp. We'll see if you can keep up." Trey shook his hand, the gratitude and determination shining in his eyes. "I'll be here," he promised, his voice unwavering. Back in his small corner of the city, Trey sat on a bench, the weight of the day finally settling on him. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. But he also knew that hope was fragile, easily shattered. The road ahead would be long, full of obstacles he wasn't sure he could overcome. But he had to try. As the evening sky turned shades of gold and crimson, Trey thought of Sophia, of her small hand reaching out to him, and of the way she had trusted him. That trust, that brief connection, had pulled him out of the darkness, if only for a moment. He clutched the crumpled flyer in his hand, a reminder that maybe, just maybe, second chances were still possible. As he looked out at the city lights, he promised himself that he would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for the hope that one day he could be proud of the man he was becoming. The sun hadn't yet risen when Trey arrived at Henderson Construction. The sky was still painted in deep blues and purples, the first hints of dawn just beginning to lighten the horizon. Trey's breath came out in visible puffs in the cold morning air, but he barely noticed the chill. His hands were rough and chapped, and his nerves were stretched taut. But he was here. He had shown up. Workers were beginning to trickle into the site, dressed in heavy work boots and thick flannel shirts. The hum of early morning conversation filled the air, along with the clatter of tools and the distant rumble of machinery. Trey felt out of place among the crew, like an outsider looking in, but he straightened his back and held his head high. "Hey!" a gruff voice called, and Trey turned to see Jim Henderson approaching. Jim's expression was guarded, his eyes sharp as he sized Trey up. "You're early," he said, his voice betraying neither approval nor disapproval. Trey nodded, his hands clenched at his sides. "Figured I'd get a head start," he replied, trying to sound confident, even though he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Jim grunted, his gaze flicking to a stack of lumber nearby. "We've got a big project starting today. You're going to help unload those and get the frames ready. Think you can handle it?" Trey swallowed hard, but he nodded. "Yes, sir." Jim's mouth twitched, almost like he was suppressing a smile. "Good. Let's see what you've got." The work was grueling. The lumber was heavy, and Trey's muscles burned as he lifted plank after plank, sweat slicking his forehead despite the morning chill. His hands, though used to hard labor, ached with the effort, but he pushed through, refusing to let himself falter. Every time he felt his strength waning, he thought of Sophia, of the hope in her eyes, and he kept going. The other workers watched him, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled skepticism. Trey could feel their judgment, the way they whispered among themselves, but he didn't let it break his focus. He had been judged before. This was nothing new. One of the younger workers, a man named Eddie, finally approached him during a brief break. Eddie had a wiry build, a baseball cap pulled low over his dark hair, and a smirk that seemed permanently fixed on his face. "Hey, new guy," Eddie drawled, leaning against a pile of 2x4s. "You trying to make the rest of us look bad or something?" Trey wiped the sweat from his brow, his expression carefully neutral. He couldn't afford to make enemies here. "Just doing what I was told," he replied evenly. Eddie's smirk widened, but there was no malice in it, just a kind of playful curiosity. "Well, don't burn yourself out too fast. We've got a long day ahead." He held out a bottle of water, and Trey hesitated for only a second before accepting it. "Thanks," Trey said, the simple gesture catching him off guard. He took a long drink, the cold water soothing his parched throat. Eddie shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. "No problem. Just don't think Jim's gonna go easy on you. He's tough on new guys, especially ones without, the usual credentials." Trey's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew what Eddie meant, and he knew that his past was a shadow he couldn't shake. "I'll keep that in mind," he said quietly. The day wore on, the hours blurring together in a haze of sweat and aching muscles. Trey worked harder than he had in years, his body protesting every movement. But he refused to give up. He had spent too long feeling helpless, too long believing he had no future. Today was his chance to prove otherwise. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Trey was running on sheer willpower. His limbs felt like lead, but he kept moving, kept pushing, until Jim finally called for a break. Trey leaned against a stack of lumber, his chest heaving, and closed his eyes for a moment. "Hey!" A familiar voice pulled him out of his exhaustion, and Trey opened his eyes to see Elena, Sophia's nanny, standing nearby. She was holding a thermos and a paper bag, her warm brown eyes filled with concern. "Elena," Trey said, surprised. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What are you doing here?" Elena smiled, though there was a hint of worry in her expression. "I heard you were working here," she said, glancing around at the busy construction site. "Sophia told me about what happened in the park. She couldn't stop talking about you." Trey's chest tightened at the mention of Sophia, but he managed a small smile. "She's a good kid," he said softly. Elena nodded, her smile growing. "She is, and she's lucky you were there." She held out the thermos and the paper bag. "I brought you some lunch. Figured you could use a decent meal." Trey hesitated, the gesture filling him with a gratitude he didn't quite know how to express. He had spent so long being invisible, forgotten, that kindness felt like a foreign concept. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elena's smile was genuine, and she brushed a stray curl behind her ear. "You're welcome. Take care of yourself, okay?" She hesitated, then added, "And if you ever need anything, don't be afraid to ask." Trey watched her go, the warmth of her kindness lingering long after she had left. He opened the paper bag and found a sandwich, an apple, and a small note written in neat handwriting. "You're stronger than you think. Don't give up." Trey's throat tightened, and he folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket. He had spent so long believing he wasn't worth helping that he didn't deserve a second chance. But maybe, just maybe, there were still people who saw something in him, something worth saving. The afternoon was just as grueling as the morning, but Trey felt a renewed sense of determination. He worked harder, his muscles screaming in protest, but he pushed through. He wouldn't waste the chance he had been given. When the day finally came to an end, the crew gathered around Jim for a debriefing. Trey stood at the back, his body exhausted, but his heart still beating with hope. Jim's eyes swept over the group, lingering on Trey for a moment. "Good work today, everyone," he said, his voice gruff. "And Collins, you didn't disappoint." Trey's heart skipped a beat, and he nodded, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the crew dispersed, Trey felt a hand clap him on the shoulder. He turned to see Eddie grinning at him. "Looks like you passed the first test," Eddie said. "Not bad for a new guy." Trey chuckled, the sound rusty from lack of use. "Thanks. I'm just glad to be here." Eddie's grin widened. "Well, keep it up. Maybe you'll stick around." He gave Trey a friendly nod before heading off, leaving Trey standing there, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Belonging. Trey gathered his things and started the long walk back to his usual spot in the city, his body aching but his spirit a little lighter. He thought of Elena's kindness, of the way she had believed in him, and of the note she had written. For the first time in years, Trey allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could start over. The city lights glowed in the distance, and Trey walked toward them, each step carrying him closer to a future he was finally willing to fight for. Marcus Turner sat at the kitchen table, a stack of case files spread out before him, but his focus was shot. His mind kept drifting back to Sophia's voice, the way she had defended Trey in the car, insisting that he was brave and nice. Marcus rubbed his temples, frustration and guilt warring within him. Sophia had always been a trusting, kind-hearted child, and Marcus had done everything he could to protect that innocence. But now, he wasn't sure if he had overstepped, if his protective instincts had led him to misjudge a man who had only tried to help. He sighed, leaning back in his chair as his phone buzzed. It was a text from David Chen, his best friend and fellow lawyer. "David, hey, you holding up okay? Want to grab a drink later and catch up?" Marcus stared at the message, tempted to accept, but instead he found himself typing something else. Marcus, "Actually, I need some advice. You free to talk now?" David replied almost immediately. David, "Sure thing. Call me." Marcus took a deep breath and dialed David's number. It only rang once before his friend picked up. "Marcus, what's up?" David's voice was warm, familiar, the kind of comfort Marcus hadn't realized he needed. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, trying to organize his thoughts. It's about Sophia, he began, his voice heavy with uncertainty. She had a scare in the park yesterday. Some boys were bullying her. David's voice grew serious. Is she okay? She's fine, Marcus assured him, though the memory still made his chest tighten. A man stepped in and protected her. A homeless man. He paused, the words feeling strange on his tongue. His name's Trey. Sophia says he was brave, but I didn't know how to feel about it. About him. David was silent for a moment, and Marcus could almost hear his friend thinking. You think he's dangerous? David asked carefully. Marcus let out a frustrated sigh. I don't know. He didn't do anything wrong, but the way he looked, tired, worn down, I just couldn't help but worry. What if it had been some kind of scam? Or worse? David's tone softened. I get it, man. You're a father. It's your job to worry about Sophia's safety. But if he really did help her, maybe he's not what you think. Sometimes people surprise you. Marcus frowned, his mind flashing back to Trey's face, the calm way he had handled the situation. I don't know. Sophia keeps talking about him like he's a hero. It's hard for me to reconcile that with the way he looked. David was quiet for a beat. Maybe it's worth looking into, he suggested. You're a lawyer. You know how to get information. Maybe learning more about him will give you some peace of mind. Marcus considered that, the idea both comforting and unsettling. Yeah, he said slowly. Maybe you're right. That night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Marcus found himself sitting in his home office, staring at his laptop screen. The search bar seemed to taunt him, as if daring him to dig deeper into Trey Collins' life. With a sigh, he typed in the name, feeling a pang of guilt as he did so. The results were sparse, but what he found made his heart sink. Trey had once been a respected carpenter, known for his craftsmanship and dedication. But then there had been an accident, a car crash that had claimed the lives of his wife and young daughter. The articles hinted at a downward spiral after that, a struggle with addiction, and eventually, homelessness. Marcus sat back in his chair, the pieces falling into place. Trey hadn't always been the man he was now. Life had dealt him a series of devastating blows, and he had never recovered. Marcus felt a twinge of shame for judging him so harshly, for assuming the worst based on appearances alone. But he couldn't shake the protective instinct that made him wary. It was his job to keep Sophia safe, and trust didn't come easily to a man who had seen the worst of humanity in courtrooms day after day. Still, Trey's story stirred something in him, something he couldn't ignore. The next day, Marcus found himself at Willow Creek Park, standing near the playground where the incident had happened. Sophia was with Elena, her laughter ringing out as she played, but Marcus's eyes were searching for something else, or someone else. He spotted Trey sitting under the sycamore tree, his shoulders hunched and his head bowed as he scribbled something in a small, battered notebook. Marcus felt his stomach twist with discomfort. Confronting Trey was not something he had planned, but he knew he had to. With a deep breath, Marcus walked over, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel path. Trey didn't look up until Marcus was standing right in front of him. When he did, his expression was guarded, wary, but not surprised. "Mr. Turner," Trey said, his voice neutral but steady. Marcus's jaw clenched at the formal address, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Trey," he began, his voice measured, "I wanted to thank you for what you did for Sophia. I shouldn't have judged you so quickly." Trey's eyes flickered with something, surprise maybe, or disbelief. He closed his notebook, his hands resting on top of it. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Marcus nodded, the admission striking a chord in him. "I understand that," he said, "but I still feel like I owe you. Sophia. She thinks the world of you." Trey's gaze softened at the mention of Sophia, and Marcus couldn't help but notice the way his shoulders seemed to relax, just a little. "She's a good kid," Trey said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Reminds me of my daughter." The mention of Trey's daughter made Marcus's heart clench, but he didn't press for more. He could see the pain in Trey's eyes, the way it seemed to cling to him like a shadow. "I did some reading," Marcus admitted, his voice lower. "I know what happened to you. I'm Sorry for your loss. Trey stiffened, his hands tightening around the notebook. For a moment, Marcus thought he had overstepped, but then Trey let out a slow, shuddering breath. Thank you, he murmured, his voice cracking. It was a long time ago, but some wounds don't heal. Marcus's own heart ached at the raw honesty in Trey's voice. He had built his life on protecting his daughter, on keeping her safe, but he couldn't imagine the pain of losing her. The thought made him want to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but he held back, unsure if it would be welcome. Instead, he said, if you ever need anything, help, a meal, someone to talk to, you can come to me. Trey's eyes met Marcus's, and for the first time, there was a hint of vulnerability in his gaze. I appreciate that, he said, though his tone was cautious, as if he was afraid to hope. They stood there in silence, two fathers, bound by different struggles, but united in their love for their children. Marcus realized that trust wouldn't come easily, but maybe, just maybe, it was a start. Sophia's laughter rang out, breaking the moment, and Marcus turned to see her running toward him, her face lit up with joy. Trey watched her too, his expression softening, and Marcus knew that beneath the weariness and pain, Trey was still a man who cared deeply. Marcus knelt down as Sophia barreled into him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Daddy, she giggled, can we stay a little longer? Marcus glanced at Trey, who had picked up his notebook and stood. We'll stay, Marcus said, his voice steady. Just for a bit. As Trey walked away, Marcus watched him go, his mind still reeling from everything he had learned. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. Trey Collins was more than he had seemed, and maybe it was time to stop seeing him as a threat and start seeing him as a man. Trey's hands were still trembling as he walked away from Marcus and Sophia. The conversation had left him feeling raw, as though Marcus had peeled back a layer of his defenses and exposed the grief he had carried for so long. It was unsettling having someone like Marcus acknowledge his pain, someone who had seemed so distant and unapproachable. He sat back down on the bench under the sycamore tree, the notebook still clutched in his hands. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn from years of use. Inside were sketches and designs he had once dreamed of bringing to life, pieces of furniture, intricate carvings, and half-finished ideas for projects he would never complete. It was a relic from a life that had slipped through his fingers. Trey traced the lines of an old sketch, a rocking horse he had planned to build for his daughter before the accident. The memory stung, but today it felt different, less like a wound and more like a reminder that he had loved deeply, that he had once been more than the shadow of a man he felt like now. Hey, Trey, a familiar voice called. Trey looked up to see Eddie approaching, a paper bag in hand. Eddie had a crooked grin and a way of making even the heaviest days feel a little lighter. Brought you some lunch, Eddie said, holding up the bag. You looked like you could use it. Trey managed a smile, though his throat felt tight. Thanks, man, he said, taking the bag. The simple gesture was enough to make his chest ache, a mixture of gratitude and the persistent fear that he didn't deserve kindness. Eddie sat down next to him, the bench creaking under their combined weight. So, Eddie said, leaning back and folding his arms, word around the site is you did pretty damn good on your first day. Even Jim was impressed, and that guy's a hard ass. Trey's smile widened, and for a moment, he let himself feel proud. Just trying to keep up, he replied, his voice quiet. Eddie tilted his head, studying Trey with a kind of curiosity that made Trey shift uncomfortably. You know, Eddie began, I've worked with a lot of guys who've had it rough. You're different, though. You've got this thing about you, like you're carrying something heavy, but still trying to stand tall. Trey's grip on the paper bag tightened, and he looked away, focusing on the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves. We all have our stories, he murmured. Mine's just complicated. Eddie nodded, his expression thoughtful. Well, whatever it is, I'm glad you're here, he said. We could use a guy like you. And if you ever need to talk or need anything, I'm around. Trey felt the weight of Eddie's words settle over him, a warmth that he hadn't realized he was missing. It had been so long since he felt like he belonged anywhere, so long since anyone had offered him more than a passing glance or a judgmental stare. Thanks, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I mean it. They sat in companionable silence, eating their lunch as the city moved around them. For a brief moment, Trey let himself believe that things could get better, that maybe he wasn't doomed to be alone forever. Later that afternoon, Marcus was in his office, but his mind was far from the case he was supposed to be working on. He kept thinking about Trey, about the man he had judged so harshly, and the story he had uncovered. It was a sobering realization that people were more than their appearances, that sometimes the strongest among them were the ones who had suffered the most. A knock at his door startled him out of his thoughts. Marcus looked up to see Elena standing there, her expression serious. "Mr. Turner," she said, stepping into the office. "Can I talk to you about something?" Marcus gestured for her to sit, his curiosity piqued. Elena had worked for him for years, caring for Sophia with a patience and love that he would always be grateful for. But right now, she looked worried. "It's about Trey," Elena began, her voice soft but firm. "Sophia's been talking about him non-stop and, well, I think he's had a rougher life than most people realize. I know you're protective of her, and I understand why, but I think he might be someone who needs a second chance." Marcus frowned, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his desk. "You think I should trust him?" he asked, his tone cautious. Elena's eyes softened and she leaned forward. "I think," she said gently, "that sometimes the people who have suffered the most are the ones who understand kindness the best, and Sophia sees something in him. Maybe we should too." Marcus's chest tightened at her words, and he found himself thinking about the grief in Trey's eyes, the strength it must have taken for him to keep going. He didn't know if he was ready to trust Trey completely, but he knew one thing. He wanted to be the kind of father who could see the good in people, the way his daughter did. "I'll think about it," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful. Elena nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "That's all I ask." Trey showed up to work the next day, feeling the ache of yesterday's labor in every muscle, but he was ready to push through. He had faced pain before, both physical and emotional, and he wasn't going to let this stop him. As he walked onto the construction site, he felt a little more sure of himself, a little more at ease. The simple fact that he had made it through his first day without being dismissed felt like a victory. Eddie greeted him with a grin, a cup of steaming coffee in his hand. "Look who survived the first day," he called, tossing Trey a wrapped breakfast sandwich. Trey caught it, surprised but grateful. "Thanks," Trey said, unwrapping the sandwich and taking a big bite. The warm food settled in his stomach, chasing away some of the exhaustion that clung to him like a shadow. Eddie clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Don't thank me," he said with a chuckle. "You're part of the team now. Gotta keep you fed if you're gonna help us get this place built." Those words, part of the team, struck a chord deep in Trey's chest. He hadn't felt like he belonged anywhere in years, and hearing that made the loneliness he carried seem a little less suffocating. He swallowed down the lump in his throat and nodded. "I'll do my best." The work was no less grueling than the day before, but Trey found that the camaraderie of the crew made it bearable. The men around him joked and teased each other, and Trey even found himself laughing at some of their antics. Eddie, in particular, seemed to have taken it upon himself to keep Trey's spirits up, telling ridiculous stories and making faces when Jim wasn't looking. Jim Henderson was still a hard man to read, but Trey noticed that he was paying attention. Every now and then, Trey would catch Jim watching him, a thoughtful expression on his face, as if he were weighing and measuring Trey's worth. Trey knew he had to prove himself every single day, but he was willing to do it. During their lunch break, Trey sat on a pile of lumber, scribbling in his notebook. The sketches came easier now, his hands remembering the art that had once defined him. He drew plans for small projects, simple things like wooden toys and garden benches. It was the first time in years that he felt inspired, that he allowed himself to imagine a future where his work could mean something again. Eddie plopped down beside him, peering over his shoulder. "What you got there?" he asked, curiosity lighting up his eyes. Trey hesitated, but then he showed Eddie the sketches. "Just some designs," he said quietly. "Stuff I used to build before." Eddie's eyebrows shot up. "Whoa! You made stuff like this?" he asked, clearly impressed. "These are incredible. You ever think about getting back into it?" Trey felt a pang of longing, the kind that made his chest ache. "I'd like to," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's hard to start over." Eddie's grin turned thoughtful. You know, my brother-in-law runs a little woodworking shop downtown. If you're serious about it, maybe I could put in a good word for you. He's always looking for talented hands. Trey blinked, the offer taking him completely off guard. Hope flared up inside him, tentative and fragile, but real. "You'd do that?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Yeah, man," Eddie said with a shrug, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You're good people. We look out for each other." Trey looked down at his sketches, his vision blurring. He had spent so long feeling unworthy, so long believing that people only saw his mistakes. But here was Eddie, a man who barely knew him, offering him a chance, a way back to the life he had lost. "Thank you," Trey said, his voice thick. "I don't know what to say." Eddie just nudged him with his elbow, his grin wide and genuine. "Just say you'll think about it. We've all needed a second chance at some point." Meanwhile, Marcus found himself at a crossroads. He had spent the past few days wrestling with his instincts, his desire to protect Sophia, clashing with the empathy he had started to feel for Trey. The search he had done on Trey's past had left him with more questions than answers, but it had also humanized the man he had once seen as a threat. That evening, Marcus sat in his living room, watching Sophia as she played with her dolls. Her laughter filled the house, a sound that always made his heart feel full. But today, it also made him think of Trey, of the pain and loss he had endured. Marcus couldn't imagine life without Sophia. The thought alone made him feel like he couldn't breathe. "Daddy," Sophia said, breaking into his thoughts. She held up one of her dolls, a big smile on her face. "Do you think Trey likes dolls?" Marcus chuckled, though the question took him by surprise. "I'm not sure," he said. "Why do you ask?" Sophia tilted her head, her young face full of wisdom that always caught him off guard. "I think he gets lonely," she said. "Maybe he needs a friend." Marcus's chest tightened, and he felt that familiar pang of guilt. Sophia had a way of seeing the good in people, of giving them the benefit of the doubt. It was a trait he admired, but it was also one that made him worry. He wanted to keep her safe, to shield her from the harshness of the world. But maybe he realized he had underestimated how much she understood. "Maybe he does," Marcus murmured, reaching out to pull Sophia into his lap. "You're a kind little girl, you know that?" Sophia beamed, wrapping her small arms around his neck. "You should tell him, Daddy," she whispered, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Tell him he's not alone." Marcus held his daughter close, his heart aching with the truth she had spoken. Perhaps it was time to take a step forward, to show Trey that someone saw him, that someone cared. Maybe it was time for a second chance, not just for Trey, but for Marcus to be the man he wanted to be, compassionate, open, and willing to see beyond his fears. The next morning, Trey woke up earlier than usual. The city was still quiet, the sky a soft shade of dawn, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. Eddie's offer from the day before kept replaying in his mind, filling him with cautious hope. He packed his few belongings, making sure to keep the sketches tucked safely in his notebook. When he arrived at the construction site, the air buzzed with the familiar rhythm of work. He greeted Eddie, who gave him a knowing grin, and got to work, feeling more a part of the team than he ever had before. Just before lunch, Trey was surprised to see Marcus Turner approaching. Marcus, dressed in his usual crisp suit, looked out of place among the construction workers, but his expression was different today, less guarded, more open. Trey straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow as Marcus stopped in front of him. "Trey," Marcus began, his voice steady but warm, "I wanted to talk to you." Trey's heart thudded in his chest, but he forced himself to meet Marcus's gaze. "Sure," he said, bracing for whatever came next. Marcus hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I judged you unfairly. But after learning more about you, and after talking to Sophia, I realized that I was wrong. You did something incredible for my daughter, and I'm grateful." Trey was stunned into silence. An apology was the last thing he had expected, and hearing it from Marcus, a man who clearly took pride in his strength and status, meant more than he could say. He nodded, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you. That means a lot." Marcus shifted, seeming almost uncomfortable, but he pushed through. "Sophia thinks the world of you," he continued, a small, genuine smile breaking through. She even told me I should make sure you know you're not alone. The words hit Trey harder than he'd anticipated. He felt a lump form in his throat, and he had to blink back the sting of tears. Sophia's a special kid, he managed, his voice thick. She reminds me of my daughter. Marcus's eyes softened with understanding. I can't imagine what you've been through, he said quietly. But if you ever need anything at all, I want to help. Trey's defenses wavered, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that he didn't have to face the world alone. I appreciate that, he said, his voice sincere. I really do. The two men stood there, a moment of genuine connection bridging the gap between their very different lives. Marcus extended his hand and Trey took it, their handshake firm and full of unspoken respect. Later that day, Trey found himself back at the park, sitting under the familiar sycamore tree. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Sophia ran over to him, her laughter like music, and Marcus watched from a distance, a small smile on his face. Trey showed Sophia the sketches in his notebook, and she marveled at his drawings, her eyes wide with wonder. "You're really good, Trey," she exclaimed. "You should make something." Trey laughed, the sound light and full of hope. "Maybe I will," he said, and for the first time, he believed it was possible. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Trey felt the weight he had carried for so long begin to lift. He had found allies in unexpected places, people who believed in him and saw him as more than his past mistakes. And as he watched Sophia run back to Marcus, her father's arms open to catch her, Trey knew that this was only the beginning of something new. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would still have its challenges. But for the first time in a long while, Trey was ready to face it, armed with hope, new connections, and the belief that second chances were worth fighting for.